Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the International Phytobiomes Alliance webinar series. This is our second webinar. We launched our webinar series in 2019, and this is Kelly Eversole, and I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance, and we are joined today by David Smith and Matthew Ryan from CABI. But before we start with them, I'd like to give you a little bit of an introduction regarding the Phytobiomes Alliance. We are a nonprofit consortium of industry, academic, and governmental scientists. We have a number of sponsors, both in terms of industry and in terms of academia, and our sponsors actually make webinars such as this possible. Before we really launch into our discussion today, I thought it might be useful to explain what a phytobiomes is. It really is looking at the complex system of plant-based agriculture. It's the idea that there is plants in a particular environment or a particular biome. So that is why we call it a phytobiome. And the biome itself consists of climate, weather, and water, microbiomes and macroorganisms, as well as arthropods and other animals and plants, and it's all based in a soil substrate. Importantly, all of the phytobiome is influenced by management practices. Our vision is that by 2050, all farmers will have the ability to use predictive and prescriptive analytics based on geophysical and biological conditions for determining the best combination of crops, management practices, and inputs for a specific field in any given year. Our next webinar will be on the 4th of June, and you can register for that. Go to the Phytobiomes Alliance website for information. But today, we're very pleased to have CABI present on the Nagoya Protocol, and particularly with regards to access benefits, and are very pleased to have Matthew Ryan and Dr. David Smith, who will join us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Matthew, and I want to thank you for your participation. I think I'm turning it over.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And firstly, thank you to you and the Alliance. And on behalf of David and myself and CABI, thank you for the opportunity to come together to speak about this really important topic that affects all of those working in the phytobiome, be they microbiologists, ecologists, or data scientists. So we're just going to give you a little bit of an overview of what CABI is about and some of the background to why we work in this area. So firstly, I will say that we are microbiologists. We are not lawyers, so we're not intending to go into legal questions today. And our advice would be, if you have any questions along this line, to contact a professional attorney. We are working microbiologists, and we curate a collection, an internationally renowned collection, containing around about 30,000 microorganisms. These have been deposited over many, many years. So we're used to having to deal with biosecurity and all legislative requirements regarding the safe access and provision of those organisms, both in the academic sector and the commercial sector. We're now looking to develop our collection resources to incorporate phytobiome infrastructure in order that we can underpin this really valuable area of research. Dr. David Smith, who will be giving the key part of this presentation, has over 45 years experience and has sat on several international bodies looking at the Nagoya Protocol and its implementation. So just to talk to you a bit about CABI and who we are and why this is interesting to us. We were established in 1910. We are a UN treaty level organisation, headquartered in the UK, but we are global in our status and approach. We are owned by 48 member countries, which makes us pretty unique. Our mission is to act as a not-for-profit international organisation to improve people's lives by providing information, applying scientific expertise to solve problems in agriculture and the environment. I guess anybody working in the phytobiome would at some point in their careers have accessed a CABI product, whether it be one of the CAB abstracts or more recently the Plant-Wise Knowledge Bank, which is available to all scientists globally. As I mentioned, we have 48 member countries, and these are really global in their makeup. In the Americas, we have Canada and Chile. In Europe, we have the UK, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. But globally, we're much more broadly represented, and we have a very strong presence in the Caribbean, in Asia, and in Africa. We have scientific centres located in the UK, in Switzerland, Ghana, in Pakistan, in Malaysia and Kenya, as well as offices located around the world, including the USA and the Netherlands. As we go through this presentation, we come across some quite interesting terminology and acronyms, and it's really important to get a handle on these as we start, because it can be very confusing to anybody who's not familiar with them. So Kelly has already mentioned in her opening the term access and benefit sharing. We also have terms such as mutually agreed terms, prior informed consent, international regulatory certificates of compliance, the Convention of Biological Diversity, digital sequence information, COPMOP, the Conference of the Parties, national focal points, and competent national authorities. And as we go for this presentation, David will expand on all of these points to give you a better understanding of what they need. And as I mentioned, it's really important to grasp these at the outset because it can be quite confusing. So some of the key questions we'll be asking during this webinar are, what is access and benefit sharing in the context of the Nagoya Protocol? Does it apply to me? You might think that your organisation is in a country that's not signatory to Nagoya, but actually you still have to follow the laws and regulations of the countries where you get the organisms from. How do I access key information? Where do you get it from? What procedures do I need to follow? Are there jurisdictions where I can freely collect samples? And yes, there are places where you can still go and collect samples, be it soil samples or plant samples relatively easily. The big question facing all of us at the moment, does it apply to sequence information? And finally, the big question for all of us is, are there any specific issues for phytobiomes researchers? And that is really important because the phytobiomes is accessing samples. So the question is, are these any different to what we'd have done previously? And at that point, it's an honor for me to hand over to my long-term mentor, Dr. David Smith, who's going to delve into some of the more detailed aspects of the Nagoya Protocol and how it impacts on phytobiomes researchers. David.
I'll just get my screen up. There's just a second. There we go. Everything seems to be a little delayed here. I'm sorry about this. Here we go. Right, I hope you can all see this. So my job is to open the discussions basically with some information about how CABI has undertaken compliance with the Nagoya Protocol. It's been quite an experience for us, and there are various aspects of it, and it's a broad subject. So I'm going to have a focus on just giving you a quick overview of the Nagoya Protocol. I'm going to do it from the basis of the EU regulation and its scope. We look at how CABI is compliant or becoming compliant in its utilization of genetic resources. Talk about a few of the documents that we've needed to put in place, how we carry out our assessments for assuring we are compliant, our CABI strategy, and the response we've had from some of the countries to date. I'll put this disclaimer up again. I mean, Matt has explained that we're not lawyers, we're microbiologists. So I'm not going to talk specifically about plants, but in general, we talk about genetic resources. So genetic resources can include all organisms, and they're defined by the convention as genetic resources with value and holding units of heredity. So the Nagoya Protocol came about because of one of the goals of the CBD is to ensure the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources are shared. And originally this was a voluntary process and guided by the Bonn guidelines, but there was a general consensus that there was a need for a more formal arrangement, and they discussed and brought into force the Nagoya Protocol in 2014. There is a general protocol, but it's implemented in different ways by different countries. There are some different interpretations, so it's not always straightforward when you're dealing with a country to get access and agree benefits. Just go back to the Convention on Biological Diversity. There's a tendency to forget there are three objectives to it: the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and the Nagoya Protocol is formalizing the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. So it's a legal framework that details the obligations that a user has towards the provider country that provides the resources in which they're working. It's not only the genetic resource, but it includes traditional knowledge too that can lead to a product or an element going to the marketplace. It requires traceability. It's implemented nationally, as I've said. So instead of trying to address all the different countries' regulations, I'm going to focus on a regional approach, which is the EU regulation, to which the UK is subject to, despite Brexit and all of that. We don't hear any more about that. Thank you very much. So we are still implementing the EU regulation through a statutory instrument in the UK. It only applies to genetic resources where the countries exercising their sovereign rights, their ownership over the materials, and they have established access measures, so they have a law in place. We also had to contract to the Nagoya Protocol, so they ratify the protocol. Where this is not the case, then the EU regulation is not triggered. It also applies to genetic resources that were accessed after the 12th of October 2014. But also, if you look back at the first point, it's only when the country has actually put in place its regulation. So in many countries, it's after that date. And it's not applicable to resources that are already governed by specialized international instruments, such as the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness or the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. Activities considered to be in scope of the EU regulation is really research and development on the genetic resource that leads to a component, a biochemical compound that may go onto the market directly, or is incorporated as an ingredient in something else. Or when you create an improvement, or you generate an improvement in an organism, such as a yeast, where you can use this in a manufacturing process, or you add genes to plants, for example, to give them a new property and such like. So these things are all within the bounds of the scope of the EU regulation. There are some elements of work that fall outside, so you can maintain and manage culture collection for conservation purposes. So you can grow, store, and characterize organisms descriptively, certainly phenotypically. That's outside the scope of the EU regulation. Handling and storing of biological material describing the phenotype, and where the genetic resource is not actually the object of research, such as used in testing tools, like, for example, in mold resistance testing. With respect to the microbiome, we're looking at explicitly and described that the human microbiome is definitely within scope of the EU regulation. We assume that microbiomes in other areas are in scope too. The reason for that is that they contain genetic resources of value, but generally a lot of the research in the microbiome stops with its characterization, and really it depends on the position of a country with regard to digital sequence information when you're generating that, and how you might use that to whether it is actually in scope or not. So there's still a few grey areas until all this is resolved, but essentially the microbiome, if it's utilized, harnessed in any way, it would trigger the EU regulation. So I like pictures, and this one was actually provided to me by the regulator in the UK, the Department of Business and Energy Industrial Strategy, to get an overview of the requirements when you wish to work with a genetic resource. So you've identified it, you know where you're going to get it from, and so you need to contact the country national authorities to get permission and find out whether they've got access measures. Now, you can do this by directly contacting the national focal point or the competent national authorities, and the details of who these people are on the ABS Clearing House, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But beware, if you're just looking on that to see if the countries have got regulations in place, it's not always up to date. So it's clear when there are measures, you see them there, but if there are no measures, you still got to check to make sure they haven't been put in place or the website is not being updated. So where there are measures, you acquire prior informed consent, and you agree mutually agreed terms, and when you're negotiating, you really must make sure that all the potential uses that you wish to make of that genetic resource are included, and that you define with the country the benefits that you wish to share. Once this is agreed, the country may issue an internationally recognized certificate of compliance, but that's not always the case. And also beware that it doesn't mean you can go straight and access the material, because there may be other regulations that you may have to follow before you can go and get that material and transport it home. Such things as quarantine regulations, shipping regulations, biosecurity regulations, for example. And this is also the case when there are no measures in place. There may be nothing you have to do in terms of access and benefit sharing, but you still have to have the permits necessary if they're in place for these other purposes. And in Europe, you have to maintain all the information and agreements for at least 20 years, and also be able to pass them on to subsequent users. Particularly if you're a collection, you've got to give legal clarity on how the recipient can utilize the material. When it comes to benefit sharing, there may be other requirements by the country in which you're carrying out the work. In Europe, you're required to provide a due diligence declaration to the competent national authority in the country in which you work when you receive research funding to utilize that genetic resource. And also, when you get a product, going onto the market, you must make a second due diligence declaration. These declarations are then communicated to the ABS Clearing House with a checkpoint communique. And that's the situation in Europe. Other countries may have different reporting and monitoring requirements, so you really need to know what those are. And when it comes to benefit sharing opportunities, the country can share in the in non-monetary agreements such as participation in the research. They can have joint ownership of the product, or they may receive monetary rewards or benefits through royalties from profits made from the sale of the product. This all must be, as I say, encased in the mutually agreed terms. If you want to use your genetic resource in a different way, this might trigger a new use and having to go back to the country to renegotiate the benefits that will come from that new use. So it's best to get the agreement correct in the first place. As Matt pointed out, and I mentioned earlier, digital sequencing information is still under debate. It's a broad issue and it has many implications for science as well as for access and benefit sharing. And the question is whether sequence information should be treated in exactly the same way as genetic resources, so that if you access the sequence, then it triggers a requirement for benefit sharing. And the debate continues. So much so the developing countries want to try and draw this to a close, and they've linked adoption of the post-2020 biodiversity framework with a decision on digital sequence information. The CBD Secretariat have pulled together a lot of information, asked for submissions and views on the topic. They've commissioned various reports, and they've been discussed in ad hoc technical expert groups with a view to present it all and hopefully make a decision at COP15 this year. Whether it goes ahead or not depends on the current situation. But we hope that there will be some agreement soon. In Europe, we've got some clarity at long last on how to deal with invasive alien species, but this is only in draft guidance on the implementation of the current EU regulation. In that alien species, once established in the country, either they're growing there, they've had a couple of generations or so in country, they are treated to be treated as in situ, and therefore they come under the law of the country. If there are any access regulations, it becomes in scope within the EU, and access is determined by the country. Prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms are required for species introduced intentionally before they are used, and things that have got in unintentionally but haven't quite got established yet are outside the scope of the EU regulation. So materials considered out of scope would be those genetic resources governed by international agreements, the human genetic resource, but as I've said, it's the human microbiome is in scope, and anything that's bought as a commodity is out of scope. But if you start doing research and development on it, looking for new products or other scientific outputs, then you will bring this into the scope of the EU regulation. Human pathogens, animal pathogens, and the like are not in the scope of the regulations if they're brought in on the animal unintentionally or by humans unintentionally. But if you start doing research other than looking at them for remedial action, they fall into utilization and fall under the scope of the EU regulation. So further research on a pathogenic organism triggers the EU regulation. And derivatives, these are naturally occurring biochemical compounds that come from organisms. If you access them without a genetic resource, i.e. you buy them as a commodity or product, then this doesn't trigger the EU regulation. If it comes with the genetic resource and you're exploring the derivative from that genetic resource that's been subject to pick and mat and under the scope of the regulation, then this work needs to be agreed under the mutually agreed terms and benefits shared. You have a job to do if you're receiving materials from other people. You may receive it with a material transfer agreement. Not often do you get offered the pick and mat agreements, but you really need to see these before you could understand how you can use that material. If you want to use a use that's not expressed in the mutual agreed terms, then you may need to renegotiate the benefits that might come out of that with the country of origin as a new use. So you really need to check these thoroughly when you receive the material. Take a look at the ABS Clearing House to see if whether there are measures in place. If it's not clear, you still need to contact the national focal point to be certain. However, within Europe, if you access materials from a culture collection that's on the register's list of collections, they provide legal clarity and have done the due diligence for you, and they will provide the relevant information that you need to ensure you're compliant. And that satisfies the EU regulation. If you're seeking the materials yourself, it's as the diagram you saw earlier, you need your prior informed consent before accessing the resources. And it's a good idea when you're developing projects to think about these things first and foremost before you start answering a call for research. Make sure that you've got in position, you know what is needed to actually get access to the materials you need for the work you're undertaking. Again, make sure that everything you want to do with the material is in the mutually agreed terms, and you need to follow the national registration reporting processes that are in place in the country where you're working. In Europe, it's the due diligence declarations, and then retain the information you've got for future use and proving compliance. So how's CABI dealing with all of this? We're considered both a provider and a user of genetic resources. We have our own collection, as Matt explained, 30,000 strains of microorganisms. And so we're an intermediary in that process. We need to make sure that we have the information necessary for compliant use, all about the access and benefit sharing commitments that have been made on accessing the material initially, and pass that on to subsequent users so they can comply. CABI's policy is to perform due diligence regarding access and benefit sharing and put in place best practices to comply with national legislation. And I'll talk a little bit about more about that in a moment or two. This is a tremendous burden, and we're trying to find ways of reducing this administrative burden associated with all the negotiations that are necessary. We participate in national stakeholder discussions to hopefully progress up into the negotiations, some practical solutions and hopefully better approaches. We contact the national focal points to discuss country-specific best practice and overarching pick and mat. Those discussions haven't been entirely successful. I'll mention this a little bit later, but we're looking to reduce the need for many negotiations that for the access that we require for our work. And CABI's instigated a development fund project. It's established ABS champions to secure agreements with genetic resource provider countries and providing information to staff to ensure that they're compliant within CABI centres. Our strategy was to produce our policy, but not just apply it to countries with law. We want to maintain good relationship with all the countries that we partner with, and when we use their genetic resources, we agree to share benefits, non-monetary benefits, with those countries too. We carry out ABS assessments when at the project design stage, and as I say, we've got ABS champions to support staff ensuring compliant access and use. And we try to get in the state of readiness. We need to understand the negotiations take time, and we need to understand what we need to do to get access to particular organisms, such as biocontrol agents, that could delay the work that we wish to do. We support initiatives that, as I say, reduce administrative burden by contributing to discussions. We've put position statements into the digital sequence information discussion. We're looking for a common understanding of what benefits are appropriate for specific uses. And we're looking for a special consideration for including facilitated access for uses that are in the public good. We've been running this development fund project for quite some time, and even after 6 years now since the Nagoya Protocol came into force, many countries' policy and regulatory environment and processes remain in their infancy. There are 123 countries that have ratified, but only 67 of those have law in place, and the others are still thinking about it. What are the, what's the best process to put in place, and how will they benefit best? And so it's very difficult to negotiate with countries when they're in that state. And even now, the EU are coming up with draft guidance with different interpretations on how to implement the EU regulation. It's a learning exercise, and I think that's good if the EU is willing to make things more appropriate for science and just to reduce delays and restriction of use, but to ensure that benefits are shared as agreed in the CBD. One of the things you can do is produce best practices, but unfortunately countries don't have the processes in place to accept these. The EU and Switzerland are exceptions, and our Swiss Centre has recently succeeded in getting endorsement and recognition of their best practices in Switzerland. When we approached the EU, when UK was in the EU, there was still that threat of us leaving, and they refused to put us through the process until it was resolved. But the EU are recognising best practices. You'll find quite a number of best practices on the ABS Clearing House, but they are published there to make people aware of them rather than being recognised as useful tools. In 2019, under the project, we tried to get we sought agreements in 5 countries, and to a certain extent, we've done that. In China, we've got an interim agreement through our joint laboratory there. They are in the process of negotiating and developing law and process there. So when that's implemented, no doubt our agreement will have to change. In India, it's proven difficult over many years to try and get access to materials, but we have a program of work with the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, and they've been carrying out the negotiation with the National Biodiversity Authority there, and we're receiving samples for our projects. They've accepted our programs of work. I've been to Chennai to discuss access, and they demonstrated their online system, which should only take 45 days to get approval for access. But this is yet to be tested by us. It does mean that you have to have all the right information at the right time and put into their system. And it's a good idea to actually talk to them about what that is. Their interpretation is always slightly different to yours. And we've got best practices in place in the other countries. We've negotiated with Pakistan. We were trying to get an MOU with them, a memorandum of understanding, which we achieved in Ghana. But by the time we got to the end of the discussions, they felt that actually CABI's uses were good ones, and we didn't need any special agreement, only if we were entering into a project that would deliver something to the market where we would need a separate agreement. Documents we've got in place, we've got our policy, our best practice, and we've created a resource for our staff to better understand what their responsibilities are within the regulations. Not only the EU, because of course we're an international organisation, we've got genetic resource research going on in 11 of our centres. We need to know exactly how the ABS of the different countries, ABS process in the different countries sort of perform, and we need to make sure we comply, which means that we could be doing allowed to do different things in different countries. We've also got the status of all the negotiations in a file to support work, so we don't have to, our project leaders and the negotiations that have already been carried out, or people are aware of them, and we don't sort of reinvent the wheel. We're active in 32 different countries. We have agreements in 17 and an MOU in another, and we publish periodic reports about our successes and failures as we're going along. CABI needs to use microorganisms and invertebrates for various reasons: diagnosis, identification, in invasive species management, studies on impact of land use and climate, long-term conservation, microbial solutions, combating threats to livelihoods, biological control agents, and increasing knowledge. So we've got a good broad use of these genetic resources. And when we're negotiating, we try to negotiate for as many of these uses as we possibly can, so that if a new use comes up, it's already agreed with the country how we would deal with that, what benefits we would share, and we don't have to renegotiate. It can be quite complicated because you just simply look at controlling invasive plants in the UK. There are 34 major ones, and the microorganisms that could be utilised come into over 20 genera, and there are many, many species of these. That the plants originate from 20 countries, and there are diseases that could be used for controlling them. But the negotiations are quite difficult because you've got countries all at different stages of implementing, recognising, or studying the Nagoya Protocol. You've got non-parties to the Nagoya Protocol, but they still may have biodiversity law and other access regulations. There are parties with law, parties without law, and there are even non-parties to the Nagoya Protocol that have got law, like Brazil, and you've got to be aware of this in your negotiation and sourcing of the biocontrol agents you want. And even classical biocontrol, where there's no real financial result, countries are still looking at it as that there are advantages, and they're looking for ways and means of sharing in those advantages. And in this area, we're working with the International Organisation for Biocontrol, where they're looking to establish this use as a public good. And the way I see it is that if people join this, I was going to say join the club, but if they join the group of countries that acknowledge this, then the reward is that they can share in the formalization and access to the biocontrol agents. So we actually support one another in fighting the problem of invasive weeds. The benefits CABI shares are mainly non-monetary, and you'll see a list of these at the end of the Nagoya Protocol. And we particularly use sharing of research and development results, collaboration in teaching and education, joint authorship. We give access during projects to our ex situ facilities and databases. We're a transfer of knowledge organisation, and we help build capacity in countries. We've actually been involved in 19 different countries to support the development of culture collections to handle copies of the organisms as they are isolated there. And in practical terms, we support people in perhaps formulation of biopesticides, for example, and develop expertise for them there. Matt has mentioned 48. There's a discussions on status of some of these countries. I list 49 member countries, and all are at different stages. 9 have ratified the Nagoya Protocol and are implementing legislation. So it should be straightforward there, but the legislation doesn't compare. It's written in other languages, and it's not always straightforward where, you know, translating the law into the processes you've got to follow to be compliant. 8 have signed the Nagoya Protocol, which means they've expressed intention to comply with the treaty. 16 are party, have consented to be bound by the treaty, but they've got no law in place. So we've got 33 countries of our 49 owner countries with different procedures, and that complicates our activities in those countries. And as I said, we've taken a country approach where we've got best practices for every centre that we have operating. There's various outreach and compliance activities are going on. We've initiated negotiations with 32 provider countries. Some offer us no deal at all when we're dealing with the overarching agreements, but specific visits we can negotiate for, or projects or programs of work, and it depends on the country. We are seeking endorsement in every country where we work of our best practice. We've got a process of ABS assessments, not only at project design stage, but during the whole process. As we've seen already, the EU has changed its interpretation of how the law is implemented, and we've got to keep abreast of that to make sure that we remain compliant. And as I said, we've got champions in Kenya, Ghana, Zambia, Brazil, etc., all our centres around the world. We target countries for agreements before we actually need them, because it takes quite the time to establish that. And we're looking at ways and means of joining the debate to influence countries and how they implement their laws. We've got some good connections in China, where our best practices are in Chinese, and we've written a report that's being published on our experiences to date, which we would hope it to be taken into consideration. And we have outreach publications. It's compliance with ABS is in our training courses, and of course, with our project negotiations, we discuss how we approach things with our partners to get common approaches. This is just an overview. I don't want to spend too long on it. It's the contents list of the generic best practices that CABI has got. These are not the ones that are accepted by individual countries, because no one country can accept processes designed to meet laws of other countries. So we've designed them for individual countries, but they contain virtually the same content adapted to meeting the law in that particular country. So accessing genetic resources, receiving biological materials, supplying it, monitoring, sharing of benefits, and enforcement are all covered. And we have in an appendix a decision tree to help staff understand what their responsibilities are in carrying out or being compliant with the ABS requirements. This is an overview of our project assessment. We look to see if organisms are being utilized in our projects, how this is used, who's the provider country, a country in which the work is carried out, and then we can actually assess if there is any ABS requirement, any due diligence declarations needed, for example, in Europe, and what we need to do for compliant access. Last year, we assessed 78 new CABI projects, and 16 have been looked at in further, because I think some of them will require some notification to the UK regulator, as we've got research funding for some of these projects that could result in products for utilisation. To date, we've assessed 191 projects. 162 of them involved genetic resources, but most of them were out of scope of the EU regulation because the provider country had no regulations in place, or didn't control access. But that, in CABI's view, does not stop us from sharing benefits. We choose to do that anyway through our project description of work, etc. 19 projects of the 191 fell in scope of the EU regulation for countries that were concerned with Brazil, China, India, Madagascar, Pakistan, Paraguay, and South Africa. We've got agreements in place where they're specifically required, but in some of these cases, it turned out that certainly in Pakistan, they said that the work we wanted to do with the organisms we had didn't trigger a requirement in Pakistan. I mentioned a number of times the ABS Clearing House, but remember, it's not always up to date. In 2017, Malaysia enacted its ABS regulations, and it's not yet mentioned on the ABS Clearing House. 67 countries have got legislative administrative policy, but even if they've got that, it's sometimes very difficult to find what the process is for application and negotiation of permissions. National focal points and competent national authorities change, the people who are involved, and sometimes it's difficult to get hold of them and get the negotiations. So it takes time. Eventually you get through. 50 countries that are not yet got law in place, negotiating deals with them is very difficult. We don't understand why the ABS Clearing House hasn't gone a bit further in helping, giving us further information. We're all asking similar questions. Where's all the answers to these questions from these countries to help us negotiate and progress science? So just a quick summary of CABI negotiations. We've got an MOU in Ghana. We've got specific agreements in place with 17 countries, including Austria, Brazil, etc. The UK doesn't have any access controls, so we can access materials from the UK. Pakistan have said that we only need to have agreements when we know we are producing a commercial product. And negotiations continue, even with Brazil and China. I've mentioned that China is still to implement its law. We have an interim agreement which will be superseded. In Brazil, we have an office in Brazil. We're trying to ascertain whether they could help monitor the movement of organisms and facilitate our access to Brazilian resources. And some of the countries, because of various reasons, haven't got back to us. We've approached them several times, such as Chile, Colombia, and there's no broad agreement possible with Uganda. When we're in negotiations with them, they just said, we have law, follow it. The country positions differ. Sorry, I'm aware the time's running out, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. There's two legislative measures in Brazil. They require a permit to collect. Foreign scientists need to be registered through a partner in Brazil, and to get permission to export materials. That's possible, but you must make sure that you've got your shipment registration with them. And benefits are triggered by a product going on the market, onto the market, and they've outlined quite clearly what those benefits are. So unless you want to follow that to the letter, you've got to negotiate with them if you just want to remove the monetary aspects from it. We have got best practices in place in Switzerland, and for all our other centres listed here, we've got best practices to suit the requirements of each country. Ghana is the only country we have an overarching memorandum of understanding for all our uses for the benefits we describe above. Trinidad and Tobago are not a party to the the Nagoya Protocol, but we have a version of the best practice that provides benefits back to the country of origin. So in summary, It's difficult to secure general agreements, but specific project-related or program-related agreements are possible. Negotiation is pretty slow, even so, and you've got to make sure you at project design or when you're seeking funding for certain activities, you must understand what your requirements are for access to materials. And quite often CABI's had to find alternative access routes, i.e. going through other countries to get similar resources where it's been too restrictive to get the agreement in place with a particular country. And we don't understand why there aren't more easy routes for these negotiations. CABI's outlaid tens of thousands of dollars to get to this stage, and other countries are doing the same. Other scientists are doing exactly the same and probably want the same answers. I'm not offering CABI as a shortcut or as a information resource, but together we should be able to do this more efficiently. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, David. We have a few questions that have come in. One is, can scientists outside CABI have access to the staff documents regarding Nagoya that you guys have put together?
Some of them. That's not an easy one. What we've tried to do is to publish as much information. Almost the entire content of the best practice, certainly the generic best practice, is in two papers. The one that's been published in China, in the process of being published in China, and one of the original documents. I can't remember which specific publication is in, but I can provide the reference to that. Or a copy of the paper. It's in open access, and for example, the decision tree is in a paper by myself and Chris Lyle from the Natural History Museum and someone from the UK National Focal Point. So you can get access to those. The best thing to do is, if you want further information, remember I'm not a lawyer. These documents are approaches that we've made, and if you approach me, I can provide you with some of the access. We haven't yet got. We've got our policy online with CABI, but not all these documents as yet. And some of the presentations that we use to train, educate our staff, so they have a better understanding. At least I could put you in touch with the owners of these, because I don't think we don't have permissions to sort of to spread them broadly. So if you've got any specific questions, then I can select the document that you really need if we've got one, or the source of information.
Great. So another question is how to make the process of granting PIC or MAT effective. Can you share a few examples of countries that are doing it successfully?
Sorry, the acronyms, what were you saying? Sharing what? Sorry, I didn't quite catch.
Sharing examples of the process of granting PIC or MAT.
Oh, yeah, as I said, it's difficult to actually find some of these for certain countries, but yes, I'm sure effectively, once the pick and mat are agreed, the country can make them public by putting on the Access and Benefit Sharing Clearing House. But as I said, there's not a lot is there as yet. I think individual organizations are reluctant to share the agreements that they spent money and time and lawyers have negotiated. I think there's a few problems there. But we're hoping that CABI is open to making some of these available if others do, and I think we need to get together to produce these the examples. But they should be on the ABS Clearing House, and I think questions to the ABS Clearing House, can we see that particular agreement? Then I'm sure that they're publicly available there. Some of the agreements, companies are allowed to keep them confidential, and if you look at some of the internationally recognized certificates of compliance, there's very little information there. They just said that the details of the negotiation are in confidence. So there's some reluctance to release them, what I'm trying to say.
Right.
I mean, we could, for example, what we could do, we can share an unsigned copy of our MOU if people wanted to see how we've gone about it in that respect.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful, David, to have that accessible.
Yeah, I'll just make a note, make sure I do make that available.
And we can also, put a link to that on the Phytobiomes Alliance website so that it would, people could then go to you and download your template of the MOU.
Yeah.
I think that would be great.
I think, I mean, the ECHO have just recently, I was involved in a publication that have described various documents to facilitate processes. They've got common clauses that should be in these agreements for access to materials and so forth. So there is some scattered information. As I say, I've been trying to pull these things together for the information resource for CABI staff, and I could explore how we might make that more available.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Our worry is we're not lawyers, and if someone picks something up, they could chase us and sue us and put us out of business if we've got something slightly wrong. So we're all reluctant to be. There's no such thing as a part-time lawyer.
Right. So how do you deal with strains that are deposited without pick or mats?
You have to take a decision. You look at the temporal requirement. Of course, in the UK, we're subject to the EU regulation, and so there's a list of criteria that the organism has got to meet. Now, if it was isolated before the CBD, it should be no problem. Before 1993, if it's collected before 2014, 12th of October 2014, the Nagoya Protocol can't apply. So you can take those types of deposits. If it's new, then you must look at the country requirements. And if there are access measures there, then you shouldn't be taking that material. There's a little bit of scope in that you can take things into private collections. You can take them into collections for conservation. But how the provider country would recognise and respond to that would be quite different. If you were sort of legitimising the collection by the materials by housing it, the country might take a stance against you. And so CABI is being very careful not to take things without pick and mat. Hence, since 1996, the collection hasn't grown very quickly because we've had measures in place because of our 49 countries to make sure that the agreements were there, and that more recently with the Nagoya Protocol, we've had to comply with the UK regulator. So it's controlled the number of accessions that are coming into our collection, which is a shame, because why we have a collection is to underpin the science, and if you can't legitimately hold these organisms and provide them on to researchers, then we're losing out tremendously. But I'm an optimist. I'm hoping that by the time we've got the 196 CBD parties signed up to the Nagoya Protocol, they'll recognise that we've all got regulation to implement the requirements of the country, honour our ABS commitments, and things will become easier. And what I've been trying to do in the microbiology world is to work with other collections in various guises, in terms of the European Culture Collection Organisation, the World Federation of Culture Collections, the more structured initiatives such as Microbial Resources Research Infrastructure, to link together globally to facilitate access. Countries want traceability. They want to see who's using their materials for what and getting the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. Most uses of organisms are in science, and it's descriptive that comes out. It's beneficial. It's not a product that goes to market. So, you know, you can do a majority of exchanges to facilitate science, and then focus in on what you do when there's a commercial use, and that's rare. I mean, it happens, but it's rare. And I think as long as there's a process in place like we have with Pakistan, when we envisage a commercial use, we discuss it with them openly, and it's a matter of engendering that trust. And I think there's a lot of mistrust around this subject. But there's a lot of over expectation too, in my opinion, that everything will result in billions of dollars in the market, and everyone wants their share of that.
Right.
Can I just come in there on the original question, Kelly? I think the important thing is you have to be prepared as a microbiologist or a phytobiome researcher to undertake due diligence on every sample you get, whatever that is. And as David's pointed out, the information is there to access, but it's knowing where to access, and that's probably the biggest barrier that people find.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. So thank you both very much. We are out of time, unfortunately. There are other questions that have been answered or that have been submitted, and these will be answered individually, so back to the person who proposed them. And we appreciate very much, David, you and Matthew participating today, and all of our participants. And we look forward to seeing many of you on our next webinar. With that, I'm Kelly Eversole, the Phytobiomes Alliance, and thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.